Hey, Tom. Tom, I was getting some feedback that you may like the FOIA form that we have now. Is that true? Can I get you on record? I'll take that as a yes for the viewers that don't have audio.
Yeah, no, I like it. It's easy to use.
I'm glad it's helpful. Okay, good to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. The focus of this is going to be on our budget situation, which was shared initially yesterday by the New Haven Independent and WTNH. Would like to go into a little bit more detail about the challenges that we're facing. Michael Gormany, the budget officer, and I both have some slides to share. Michael's going to give an overview of the situation, and then I would like to talk about why it's not as easy as one might think to fix this situation. So I'll just hand it over to you, Michael.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. All right, can everyone see my screen?
We can.
So, thank you, Mayor. Again, thank you everyone for being here. As the Mayor outlined, the city is facing various budget challenges going in from the current fiscal year that we're in, fiscal year 21, going into fiscal year 22. We're currently facing a projected shortfall that can be up to $66 million going into the next fiscal year. Now, what I will like to tell everyone is these numbers do fluctuate from time to time. Again, it was reported yesterday, our baseline was $41 million. But if you've been following, we've had a few pension meetings where the ADEC, which is the city's employer contribution to the two pension funds that we have, changed that projection as well. So the estimated shortfalls are really due to revenue growth not keeping up in pace with the city's current fixed costs. So what the city's seeing going in from one year to another year is declining revenues in various categories and increased fixed costs. So this next slide will sort of outline some of the major estimated revenue decreases and fixed costs. So what you can look at on this slide is some of the examples of the revenue decreases, building permits being one of them. So in the fiscal year 21 allocation, we had $19.4 million as a budgeted number. We're currently working with the building official to get for the estimated 22 number, which is about $11.5 million. So again, that's a $7 to $8 million decrease that you see on the revenue side. Parking tickets and meter collections, as you can see from the slide, will potentially decrease by about $3.7 million. We had a revenue initiative number of $2.5 million. On a conservative end, that most likely won't be in next year's budget. And then we have, as another example, a state construction reimbursement that we get from the state of Connecticut that's on a certain payment schedule. That will be a decrease of $1.9 million. So those were a few the major revenue items that we were looking at as a decrease in the fiscal year, going from fiscal year 21 to fiscal year 22. Overall, we're looking at about a $16 to $17 million revenue decrease when all line items are added up in the budget. On the next column, as you'll see, are the contractual and fixed cost increases that we're looking at going from fiscal year, fiscal year 21-22. As you can see, a lot of these costs on our major cost side are contractual items. So these are our fixed costs. As you can see, as I mentioned, our pension fund contribution, which the mayor and I just got those numbers this week from both of the pension funds and the actuaries, as an estimate of what the ADEC could potentially go up to. So that would add potentially up to $25 million from one year to the other, depending on the assumptions and everything that's used for the ADEC payment. We're looking at healthcare and workers' comp increases for the next fiscal year. While the city, due to COVID, is having a good year in medical and workers' comp, we do realize that, as vaccines and other things may affect COVID, the city will see a spike in medical costs at some point. So we have to make sure that we can absorb those costs within the city's budget. And then we have public safety salaries and overtime increases. That's really our fire and police departments contracts. Those are contractually obligated items that that the city has to account for going in from one fiscal year to the other. And then we had reduced operational savings. So in this fiscal year, we had almost $3.1 million in operational savings, 2 million of that requested by the Board of Alders. And then another million was various vacancy and salary savings that were accounted for that will potentially not be included in next year's budget because we're already making those cuts in this fiscal year. So those were some of the major increases that the city is facing as far as increases in the city's fiscal year 21 to 22 budget. So again, the city, based on the new numbers, could face upwards to $66 million. Again, that is not in any new departmental spending. That is really due to revenue growth not keeping up with the fixed costs that the city is seeing. So I will turn it back over to the mayor.
Thanks, Michael. Let me share my screen here, and then we can open up to questions after we. How's this looking? Is this working for folks? So just wanted to reiterate a couple of things that Michael said. So looking at our, as folks know, I'm required to present to the Board of Alders my proposed budget on March 1st. The Board of Alders then reviews it, may make changes to it, and then they approve it, and then the fiscal year starts July 1st. So we're working on preparing the fiscal year 21-22 budget now. We're in fiscal year 2020-2021. And in that fiscal year, we're facing a significant deficit. But as we prepare for next year's budget, we're looking at a much, much larger problem. And I want to remind folks that when we were preparing this year's budget last year, we cut more than 100 positions from the budget, eliminated a number of programs, and raised taxes. So we've already made significant sacrifices. And as we prepare this coming year's budget, we're looking at just to keep doing things as we are today, which I am the first to admit is inadequate because we just don't have the resources we need to address the needs of the community. But just to keep doing things as we are doing them today. As of 2 weeks ago, we thought that was around $41 million deficit, that we would need to find an additional $41 million to keep things going as we are today. In the last week, our actuaries for the Police and Fire Pension Fund and the SURF, the city's employees pension fund, have recommended additional changes in that we increase our payments to the pension fund. And there's two reasons for that. One is they, every 2 years, do a experience study and look at changes to employee habits as far as when they may buy back sick leave, when they may retire. They also look at data on how long people live. They look at data on how the new contracts may impact the retirement fund. And in particular, the police and fire fund, because a new contract was settled on in 2019, and because of some updates in the table that they use to determine when people pass away, they are recommending a $25 million annual increase in what we fund, or what we put into our pension funds. And so if you add that $41 million gap that we were anticipating to the additional $25 million recommendation from the pension funds, that would be $66 million. That also includes their recommendation that we move from an anticipated rate of return of 7.75% for our pension fund investments to a 7% investment rate of return. That's a smart thing to do, but that includes that significant increase, or contributes to that $25 million increase. And I wanted to just talk about, so we're looking at a $66 million potential deficit. And that's if we decide to follow the recommendations of the actuaries. So ultimately, we are in between a $41 million and a $66 million gap just to fill next year's budget. And I wanted to talk about why this is difficult, near impossible for us to fix. And I think from the outside, and myself as an alder included, people look at a budget that's 560, 70, 80,000 or $80 million and think, well, a 41 or a $66 million cut may be hard, but it's doable. But in reality, it's much more complicated than that, because while our budget may be that large, most of those costs we have no control over. And I'm using last year's budget, or this current year's budget, as a baseline here, just because I have not had the time to look at next year's budget. But basically, as far as this graph goes, but basically the numbers would just be slightly larger. But I wanted people to see the breakdown of the different departments and how we, in our expenditures, break down our expenses. And the issue is that we can't cut most of the things in our budget. We can't cut debt service payments because that's money that we've borrowed that we owe, and we are required to pay it. And so I've grayed that out. We can't cut self-insurance because clearly the city needs to have a self-insurance fund to cover potential liabilities. We can't cut our pension payments because we're required to pay those things in order to ensure that the retirement fund is adequately funded. It's very difficult for us to cut employee benefits unless we significantly cut our employees. And if we do cut our employees, we don't typically see a lot of those revenues in the first year, or those savings in the first year anyway. These are employee benefits such as workers' comp, healthcare. And so you have the remaining things that most people care about in our budget that fund the things like plowing our streets, police officers, fire department, our building inspections, our registrar of voters, youth department, and so on. And of course, education. People often look towards the education budget, but in reality, 3/4 of our education budget is funded through the state. And so we obviously wouldn't cut money that we're receiving from the state to pay for things. So we only have about 1/4 of our education budget that we can cut. Now, the state has a minimum budget requirement where we are not allowed to cut more than the education department was previously funded. And so it is very difficult. We basically have to flat fund our education department if we were to cut them anyhow. But ultimately, when we're looking at what we can cut from the budget, we have around $196 million left. And we're talking about a $66 million cut that we're trying to find. And when I'm looking at this and our team is looking at this, that is impossible to do. It's impossible to do. And to give you some examples of, to give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about, the library budget is $4 million. So if we cut the entire library budget, we would be down to $62 million that we need to cut. The entire police department budget is $43 million. The fire department budget is $34 million. Our youth department budget is $2 million. All of public works is around 16 million. You see public works there is 19 million because it includes engineering in that category. It's around $2 to $3 million. The amount that we would have to cut of our city services is beyond what our city can handle and the capacity that we have. It is completely unrealistic for anyone to think that we are able to cut this kind of money. Our city would not function if we cut this money. And so we have basically two options ahead of us right now. The first is massive cuts and a massive property tax increase. And to give you a sense of the scale of a tax increase, if we were to try to close that $66 million budget with just a tax increase, that's a 23% tax increase. Say we cut our budget by $30+ million, which would eviscerate most of our city services, it would still be around a 12% tax increase. That is not a sustainable option. And the second option we have, which I've said over and over and over again, is we get revenues from the state and Yale University. I'm not making this up. I'm not being fantastical about the solutions here. We don't have other options. And both the state and Yale University need to understand that if they do not play a very, very significant role in assisting us through this budget situation, it will be a disaster for our city, but also a disaster for them. Yale has an annual operating budget of $4.1 billion. And we've asked for 50 million to help us close this gap. That is a fraction. There's a fraction of what Yale could afford. And it would significantly help us address this problem. And the state, we've asked for years and years and years to increase funding for pilot, which is an even smaller fraction of the state's $21 billion budget. There are very practical ways that we can address this. We are having active conversations with the university about their responsibility and how we can positively, with the partnership with the state and Yale University, impact this city so that it continues to grow and prosper. And there's a very practical proposal that has been out there from Senator Looney about a tiered pilot structure that is supported by myself and 27 other mayors and first select people that represent large municipalities and small towns, that represent Republicans and Democrats, and that would dramatically help us address this financial problem without having a significant impact on the state. The cost to the state of Senator Looney's tiered pilot proposal is around $114 million. It would bring in around $40 million to New Haven, which would significantly move the dial on this challenge that we're facing. And the governor has talked a lot about not wanting to raise taxes around the state. I understand that, but I think that that is intellectually inconsistent with what would actually happen if the governor decided to not do something here, because he would be in fact raising taxes, because I would have to raise taxes significantly on New Haven residents who frankly can least afford it in this time. And so by not changing things at the state, by not adopting this tiered pilot proposal, which the governor could do without raising taxes, by the way, we will be forced in New Haven to have massive cuts that we do not want to do, that are unrealistic, or dramatically increase taxes which our residents can't afford. Michael, did I miss anything?
No, Mayor, I think you covered everything in the slides.
Okay. Any questions from folks? Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much. Maybe first, could you give us an update on how city negotiations with Yale University are going? I know that we wrote a few weeks or months ago about a committee you've put together of people negotiating directly with the university. What's happening there?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I feel like we're making progress, but I don't have another update at this point.
My second question, I guess, for you and for Mr. Gormany, back in September of 2020, you all held a press conference at City Hall announcing that despite the serious challenges to the budget presented by COVID, the city ended the fiscal year with a $1.9 million budget surplus. How did we go from, in September, you all announcing that there was a $1.9 million surplus to now, just a few months later, projecting a $66 million deficit?
So that's a great question, Tom. I think what we look at it from our perspective is on a fiscal year by fiscal year basis. The $1.9 million surplus that we had ending fiscal year 20 was really at the start of COVID. And there were definitely some factors of COVID that played into that, but we were able to mitigate that. As far as the budget challenges that we're facing in fiscal year 22, I think the mayor has been clear all along on getting the city to a more structurally balanced budget and certain revenue assumptions to get the city to a more structurally balanced budget here are within those numbers. Again, we have to take, when we're looking at the budget, looking at the trends that we see in various revenue categories. Again, I think in the slides I presented, like building permits is a great example, right? We cannot, a $19 to $20 million building permit number is not going to happen every single fiscal year. So I think, looking at the fiscal year 22 budget and making those adjustments, that's where part of the deficit going into the next fiscal year is coming from, making those allocation adjustments. And again, as we mentioned, just overall fixed cost. As we mentioned, the ADEC payment, the employer contribution alone, and what the mayor talked about is 25, could be up to $25 million alone. So that's an overall budget increase that you would see going into the following fiscal year, no matter what.
I mean, Tom, I'd add to that. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but the surplus was driven by some unexpected savings that were related to COVID. Our Board of Ed not being in session resulted in the Board of Ed being able to more easily balance its budget, which was one of the major drivers in that particular year of the our anticipated deficit, which became a surplus. We had more positive tax receipts than we were anticipating. We were anticipating that being impacted by COVID. Our healthcare expenses were surprisingly low. We noticed that was actually a trend in other municipalities as well. We expect that that's because a lot of people were not doing elective surgery. A lot of people were working from home and less likely to be injured, things like that. And so that was a particular phenomenon in that year. In this coming year, I think, in this current fiscal year, are the challenges that we're seeing around, for example, parking meter and parking tag revenue are not improving because we have not seen an economic bounce back yet because we're still in the midst of a pandemic. And our building permit revenue is going to drop significantly because of the neuroscience center, which raised that number over the past several years because the hospital paid, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's around $6 million a year.
Correct.
That is something we're not going to receive next year. But obviously the major driver of that number is the pensions. And our actuaries are recommending, based on some significant changes to the contracts and new data, that that number go up significantly. The number was going up already. Our debt service number was going up already. And we've been clear all along that those numbers will continue to rise every year. It's becoming clearly, we're getting to a breaking point. And we also don't have the kind of tools anymore that have been used historically to address the problem. I've always been loath to use them, but we can't really use them anymore. The scoop and toss and the refinancing, we don't really have a lot of options to use that anymore because we've tossed so much that we don't have too much left to scoop. And so that's a good quote. I hope you use that in your article. But we don't have the kind of tools to use budget gimmicks if we wanted to use them or not. And so this is a bad situation that is continuing to get worse because of these systemic issues.
One more quick question before ceding the floor. What is the projected deficit for this current fiscal year?
Michael, do you want to take that?
Yep. So again, I think I've been very clear that with COVID and everything, I've testified at finance committee meetings and everything. Depending on where we end up, the deficit, I think, could land between $13 and $16 million for this year. Again, that's predicated on, just certain assumptions. So a great example was, earlier in the year, the Board of Ed was saving more money because school wasn't in session. Well, now that we have a hybrid model, some of those savings are going to be expended. So again, I think as we say, that's really a moving target. I'm projecting between $13 and $16 million for this fiscal year. Again, hopefully the city is doing everything in its power to maximize savings on city expenses. So hopefully we can get that number down like we did in fiscal year 20 by the end of the come June and July.
Other questions from folks? Go ahead, Ben. And then Kyle.
Are you obligated to meet the actuary's recommendation for the pension fund? And if not, to what extent would you be willing to deviate from what they've suggested?
Michael, are you able to take a stab at that, or do you want me to try?
I can take a stab at it. So there are two different pension funds, as you're aware. We have SURF and Police and Fire. SURF pension, as far as the recommended contribution that the actuarials have for us. There's language in the Code of Ordinances that we're looking into right now that may require us to make what the SURF board votes on, because what the city contributes to SURF board also has to vote on. We're currently looking into P&F on that very question, Mr. Lambert. Mayor, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So my understanding from talking with the actuaries is that the two pension fund boards, SURF and P&F, meet every month. And both of them have had meetings this week, P&F this morning and SURF, I think 2 days ago, where the actuaries' recommendations were given. And both pension funds decided to, because they were just hearing this information, not vote on the recommendations yet. My sense is that both boards are willing and understand the impact of the city. They're willing to work with the city to make sure that we're addressing this problem together. We all have the same goal in mind of ensuring the long-term viability of the pension funds and also not impacting the city's financial situation so much that it will lead to significant layoffs. It will potentially negatively impact the city's long-term ability to fund the pension, because we'll struggle economically to attract new residents and develop a strong tax base if we have so many financial challenges that we can't provide basic services to people. And so in the conversations that we've had, SURF and PNF, or that I've had, SURF and PNF trustees are interested in engaging us to make sure that we all make the right decision. Whether or not the city is legally bound by what they vote on, I think that we need to explore that, but I don't anticipate that will be a problem regardless, and I hope it will not be, because ultimately we all have the same goal in mind.
Just one follow-up. You mentioned the new police and fire contracts as a driver for what the recommendation is for the pension fund. Are there specific aspects of the new contracts that have changed things, changed the forecast significantly?
Michael, do you remember from this morning's meeting some of the details?
Unfortunately, I think because we were just getting the information and had the meeting this morning, I don't have or remember the exact details, Mayor, on how that impacted the actual ADAC payment for police and fire.
So we could get you some more specifics. As I recall, and they also looked at the last several years and what retiring police officers and firefighters tended to do. And one of the things, for example, is people take on more overtime in their last several years to increase their average pay, to increase their pension. And because of that tendency, we're recommending increasing payments to the pension fund. People were taking advantage of sick leave buyback to retire early. And because of that, there was impact to the fund. And there were several examples of things like that. One of the major drivers is the update to the, I forget the name of the table, but the table that indicates the likelihood of when people will pass away.
The mortality
table. And they had a new mortality table. And as I recall, was specific to public safety that significantly changed the numbers and drove them to recommend a higher contribution to the pension fund. What I anticipate, and we still need to have a lot of conversations, is that unless we get significant revenues, we're not going to land in a point where we decrease our rate of return in 1 year from 7.75% to 7%. The jump is just so significant for us to handle that kind of financial change in the city is too much. I would anticipate some sort of step down plan. But again, we still need to have some conversations about how to address the problem.
Do you have a ballpark for how much that change from 7.75% to 7% means in actual dollars?
Hang on.
Forecast actual dollars.
Give me just a second. So the two buckets of recommended changes by the actuaries. One is based on information they have, the mortality table, the change in the contract and such. For SURF and PNF together, they're recommending an increase in the annual payment of $17.8 million. To reduce, in addition to that, their second recommendation is to reduce the rate of return from 7.75 to $7 million or 7%. And that would add an additional, on top of that 17.8, $7.5 million payment annually for a total, if we follow that whole recommendation, of around $25.3 million, which added with the $41 million gap because of the other expenses that Michael outlined would get us to $66 million.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Kyle, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I did. Just to follow up on that last point. So basically, just to make sure I'm following the numbers, you're looking at a $7 million increase to the pension fund to get to that $25 million.
No, it's super complicated. So
Okay.
basically, what the actuaries are advising us is if we were to do fully what they're recommending, we would add an additional $25 million every year to the pension fund payments. And the reasoning for that is a combination of recommending we reduce the investment rate of return because they're saying our outlook is too rosy on what we're likely to make on our investments. That's the 7 million. And because of some contractual changes, the change to the mortality table, they are anticipating that we will need more money in the retirement fund to cover some of the personnel changes that will impact the long-term, their propensity to retire with a larger package. And so currently we're around annually a 60 million payment, Michael, is that right, to pension funds?
Yeah, right now we're at about 61 or 62 million dollars that the city has contributed this year to both police and fire and the city employees retirement fund.
And they're recommending we add another 25 to that.
Right, changing the discounted rate of return from 7.75 to 7 would add about an additional $25 million to that number.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. I know that you've mentioned again going to Yale, and I thought I heard you say that you've asked Yale for $50 million. Have you actually asked them for that?
I have.
Okay.
Not just once, too.
Okay. And obviously the response is you haven't gotten one. What was the response to that?
Let's just say they haven't agreed to give $50 million, or I would have told you all that already. But we're having a very lively conversation.
And what was their most recent voluntary payment?
13 million.
13 million. And when was that made?
They make it annually. I don't know when the last time is we received a check. Michael, do you know?
So they make that payment annually. So that $13 million is the voluntary plus the fire services payment that they make. Generally, that comes between August and October of each year. They make the voluntary payment around August of each year, and the fire service payment is made around October, towards the end of October.
Okay, so they've made that essentially for this physical budget year already. That payment's already come in.
Correct. The payment that they made for the year 2020, right, is made. It's kind of one of those complicated answers because the voluntary payment based on the long-standing agreement is booked towards the previous fiscal year. That was an agreement that made back in the 90s or whatever. So in essence, we would get the fiscal year 2021 voluntary payment in August of this year.
Okay. And so that could potentially offset it, but again, not enough, as we've said, to fix that. And then my last question was, I think I heard you mention that Senator Looney's plan is for $114 million for the tiered pilot plan, and that would add 40 million to New Haven. Was that right?
Approximately.
Approximately 40 million.
So the proposal by Senator Looney is that the currently municipalities that have hospital, university, and state property get reimbursed by the state. They should be reimbursed at around 77% of the loss in tax revenue, but most municipalities are reimbursed around 23, 24, 25%. in New Haven is no different, but New Haven has 60% of our property that is non-taxable. The overwhelming majority of that is the university, Yale University, and the hospital as well. Senator Looney's proposal, because it's been inherently difficult to increase pilot in full by the state, to create tiers where the baseline is each municipality gets reimbursed 30%, but then there is a 40 and a 50% tier based on the municipality's need, basically residents that may not be very economically stable. So New Haven would land in the 50% category, and other large municipalities, most of them land in the 50% category, some of them in some small towns as well. There's a number of small towns that are struggling economically as well. And so no one would get cut from pilot, but certain areas that are in need would get an increase. It's a progressive approach. It's a very practical approach. There is strong bipartisan support. In a $20+ billion budget, it does not require the state to do any significant budgetary changes. In my view, it's a no-brainer.
And then the last question, sorry, I know I said the last one was the last question, but I just.
You do it all the time.
Is there any way the Board of Alders or the city could put a moratorium on purchases by Yale? I just thought about that. Is there any way to stop that from happening for a period of time?
I don't believe so. We can't regulate private property in that way. I don't believe. And ultimately, we'd like to be in a position where we're enthusiastic about Yale's growth, where Yale's growth isn't inherently contrary to the city's ability to grow ourselves. And I think that's part of the conversation that we're having with the university is I want to support Yale growing as long as it is a positive benefit to the city, both from our residents' perspective and our financial situation. Currently, whenever Yale grows, it takes a lot of money off the tax rolls and makes it more challenging for New Haven residents. That's not a good dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And then any other thought of any buildings or anything that you might have to look at selling? I know Tom mentioned that press conference we had in the fall, you mentioned there might have had to be a point where you were to sell off property. Any sales or department consolidations or layoffs? Any thoughts there?
I think there's a lot of things on the table. I'm loath to sell city assets because we permanently lose them. We also don't have a lot of options that would cover that kind of gap. I think that the focus needs to be on equity here and institutions doing their fair share for the city, and that's the state and Yale. Okay, anything else? Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. I'll be quick. First, is the city considering issuing pension obligation bonds to fill the current pension gap?
We've discussed it. We've discussed it with our actuaries. My sense from that discussion is it is still, in my view, not a responsible thing to do. So at the moment, no.
And I know Mr. Gormany is both the city's budget director and the acting controller. I guess to Mr. Gormany, do you feel like you have the bandwidth to handle both of those responsibilities, considering these pretty huge budget challenges? And Mayor, are you considering hiring a permanent controller anytime soon?
Michael?
Sure. So I think, I've been fortunate enough to be working for the city, starting out in 1999 as an intern. So I have a great deal of the finances, historic and present at the moment to, to do both roles at the moment. And I will always do what's needed at the city to help out the mayor and all the city departments. I have a great team behind me as far as finance supervisors and management and budget staff. So we're going to keep on moving and, you know, help out the city and do what we feel is in the best interest of the city, working with the mayor.
Yeah, and Tom, I think at this point I'd give you kind of a non-answer, unfortunately, but the most important thing is that we get the job done.
Right.
And we're having conversations about how to most effectively do that with city staff.
And then my last question is, how will state or federal kind of CARES Act money or other money earmarked for kind of COVID-related reimbursements, how does any current money affect this deficit, and how might money in the American Rescue Plan or any other federal plans that are being considered right now affect this deficit? And that's my last one.
Sure, that's a great question, Tom. As you know, we continue to work and maximize our grant utilization with the CARES Act money. As you know, a lot of the time with the federal money, you cannot do what's called basically supplanting with those grants. So again, we continue to make sure that we provide the services for residents that we can, and maximize those grant opportunities and use those CARES dollars to get out to the community. But as far as like using those to offset any revenues that the city is losing or anything, you know, that's we certainly can't do that with this funding.
I think the hope is that with the Biden administration and a Democratic Congress, that we'll get additional funding, ideally that is not only tied to new things. And part of the issue, in particular with emergency funding, is that it is often tied to things that are specific to that emergency, but that don't allow municipalities to cover existing expenses that we were already anticipating. Obviously, it would be very, very helpful if the federal government allowed us to use some of the funds to address some of our systemic existing financial challenges. Historically, that's not happened. Okay.